So, two more points are left. One point is this question about dignity versus utilitarianism. This is a kind of a standard debate in the literature. And this sets Kant, who is a German from the 1700s, against Nietzsche, who is a German from the 1800s. And Nietzsche has a very, or not, I shouldn't say, it's not against. It sets Nietzsche with Kant, but in a kind of a different way. Nietzsche has a very famous quote. He says, "Man does not strive for happiness; only the Englishman does that." Nietzsche here is actually stepping in favor of Kant, though in a little different way that maybe we won't talk about now. But what Nietzsche is saying is that some form of dignity really is worth more than happiness. Right? So, going back to this original experiment, most people who get involved in dignity debates usually end up in one way or another, if they want to defend dignity, usually end up in one way or another saying that human dignity is more important than some form of human happiness. Right? And in the case of the dating application, right, the argument in favor of these experiments is that, or the strong argument, it seems to me, is that ultimately these experiments help the machine to function better. So it makes better dates, makes better relationships, and that makes better happiness in the long run. Right? And so happiness is worth it. It's worth manipulating some users a little bit at the start in order to help all users be happy in the end. And one real advantage of this stance is that in some sense, happiness usually can be measured, at least to some extent. I mean, usually you can say, look, happiness in a relationship is how long they stay married, right? Or happiness in a relationship, and let's say at the early stages of a relationship, happiness is how many messages they exchange back and forth. Right? Now, maybe these are crude measures. Maybe they're not direct measures of happiness. Of course they're not. But they are some measures, right? They do give you some sense that people really are tangibly more happy if you can show that the machine, because of certain experiments done, the machine produces more matches. Let's say the match percentage increases by 5%. Well, that's a real number. And let's say that's 500 people. Those are real people. You can count that up. Happiness is, to some extent, in many cases, something you can measure. And dignity, by contrast, it's really hard to measure that. We've given many examples of how, right, we can say, look, the computer makes language, it reduces language to counterfeit, it makes everything empty and worthless. But how do you measure that? I mean, how do you measure human dignity? What are the units? With happiness, you have this unit, you can say, number of messages exchanged. Again, I know that's not a direct measure of happiness, and I know it's just an approximation, but it is an approximation, and it is a measure. Dignity, it just seems so ineffable, so abstract. Many people, for many people, they say, look, I want to stick with something that I can measure, and that I can hope to improve, instead of this abstract idea of dignity. And as it happens, we're going to talk about this later in social well-being, but as it happens that in the 19th century and early 20th century, and throughout the 20th century, the English was a center of the utilitarian approach, which advocates for happiness against dignity. Nietzsche said no. This German said no. We should stick with dignity. And in that period, one of the foundational arguments against dignity was this argument that happiness can be measured to some extent, can be calculated to some extent. It's rational to some extent, whereas dignity seems ineffable. It can seem almost mystical. It's hard to say exactly. It's hard to look at dignity and say, "Hey, look, here's dignity. This is what it looks like. This is what color it has." All those things. It's very difficult. Right? So this is just a very quick section, but what I want to say here is that frequently when people end up defending dignity against other perspectives, frequently as the debate goes on, it ends up getting into this kind of area where you have dignity as some kind of vague human value, some sense of intrinsic worth, which is my freedom from, my protection against being treated like a tool, and my right to take responsibility for my actions. Those are definitions, but they're still ineffable. Again, those kinds of general ideas versus something very specific like, oh, I can suffer less depression because I use this tool. Right? A lot of times that's what dignity debates look like, or where they end up. They end up with some very general arguments against more concrete arguments. And people will make their own decisions about what kind of argument is worth more. Okay? So maybe you could just take a minute or two to consider that as well. This question about whether, in general, the dignity of this ineffable thing is worth more than some more countable sense of, let's just say, happiness.